Before we move on to the next unit, let's kind of look at where we've been so far. So we've been to Mesopotamia, and that civilization was called the Tigris-Euphrates River Valley Civilization because those are the two rivers that gave life to the people in that civilization, the Tigris and the Euphrates, and so that civilization existed around those two rivers. Egypt, of course, is the Nile River Valley Civilization because it was the Nile River that gave them life. And then lastly, we have India in the Indus River Valley Civilization. But do not forget that the Indus River gave them life, but the Ganges River was their holy river. So we're going to move on to the fourth and final ancient river valley civilization. This is the last discussion that we're going to have before we enter Greece. So this is the end of those ancient peoples that started it all. So let's look at China. China is called the Huang He Ancient River Valley Civilization, Huang He, and that was the name of the river, just like in all the other ones that we've talked about. So Huang He was the original ancient name of this river that gave life to China, the civilization in China. But Huang He is a little bit different. It also goes by two different names. Sometimes it's called the Yellow River, and I'll show you a picture why in a minute. Sometimes it's called the River of Sorrows, and one of the reasons it is called the River of Sorrows, well, the reason, is because of all the rivers that we've talked about, this one is the one that is most unpredictable. And there are many historical cases of this river overflowing and wiping out entire villages. So it is kind of a scary river in that sense, and lots of lives lost, and so locals often call it the River of Sorrow. So I know this picture isn't absolutely wonderful, but it's the best one that I could find. You can see, if you look close enough, why they call it the Yellow River sometimes. See the silt that is left on the shore after the floods have receded? It's yellow, and that's because the sediment at the bottom of the river is yellow. And it really, if you were standing there on the verge of the actual river, it would look much more yellow to you. So Huang He is the ancient name. More often today, you would hear it called the Yellow River. If you're looking at a modern map, it's probably going to be labeled the Yellow River because it bleeds into the Yellow Sea, so that just kind of makes sense. But locals, again, call it the River of Sorrows. All right, so China is super isolated from the rest of the world. They actually truly believed that they were the only people on the planet. And one of the reasons that they believed that is because nobody could get to them. So look at all the natural barriers that they had. You've got the Taklamakan Desert, the Gobi Desert, both killer deserts. You've got the Kunlushan Mountains, the Himalaya Mountains. You've got the vast Pacific Ocean, Indian Ocean, South China Sea. So all these different waterways, they were isolated. So you've even got mountains there at the top, and I'm not even going to try to pronounce some of those, near Russia, close to Mongolia. So they were completely, really, truly cut off from the rest of the world because of these different types of land masses or water. So for a very long time, they are only going to have themselves to think about. So mountains and deserts and water, I didn't add that to the slide, but make sure you know it, is one thing, but distance is another. China is huge. So if you really wanted to get to where the people are in China, you have to go to the East Coast. Very few people are in the central part of it or the western part of it. So that means if you're on land, you would have to travel through the entire country of China. If you did make it through the deserts and the mountains, that's a really long hike. So let's look at the population of China then and now. The population has not changed from ancient times to modern times. So even if this is modern, of course, because you see the city of Beijing in South Korea, North Korea, but this is what it looked like back then. I'm going to show you some pictures later in the unit of the dynasties that developed in China in the ancient world, and they also will be very centralized in the East. And a huge part of that is because of the terrain. You can't grow crops in a desert. It's hard to get across it. There's a lack of water. So if you don't want to live in a desert terrain or a mountain terrain, you're going to have to live on the East Coast, so you're stuck there. So the East Coast has always had a problem with population in the modern world, so much so that at one point the Chinese government decided to make it illegal for a family to have more than one child. But the result of that was something they never really thought about happening. Chinese families wanted sons to carry on their family name, as is the way in many countries. And so, if you're only allowed to have one child and it ends up being a little girl, bad things might happen to that little girl because you need a son. So they were actually killing their female children to the point where there was a generation that was hugely lacking in females for the males to marry. So it once the government finally figured it out, of course, it was after a large loss of life that they didn't realize was actually happening. So they got rid of that law, but they did make it so that you could have the more than one child, but every child after that first one, you had to pay a pretty high tax on. So, like here in America, we get a tax break for every child that we have. They're actually taxed for every extra child that they have because they feel like it is harder on their environment and their economy and their schools and everything else because there's too many children. So that actually kind of makes sense when you think about it that way. China got her very first dynasty in 1766 BCE, which is kind of amazing because it is a vast land. It's huge. And the thought that they could actually bring people together is just unbelievable. Now, they weren't controlling all of China because I'll show you a picture on the next slide of how small this dynasty actually was. But the thought that they were bringing people together in the country of China was a feat because they were so spread out and hard to get a hold of. So in 1766 BCE, they will create their very first dynasty. Don't forget that is a family ruling, so that when daddy dies, son takes over, or the eldest heir, if it's a brother or an uncle. Yes, ladies, it's always going to be a man. We know how things work in government. So don't forget that dynastic line is going to be carried down through the family. So the very first dynasty was the Shang dynasty. And one of the rules that the Shang dynasty came up with was the idea that dynastic rulers can never be removed. It's got to stay within the bloodline because they believed that the ruling family, the dynastic family, was chosen by a higher power. I'm not going to say God because they didn't really have God, but they believed that that family was chosen from a higher power. And so mortals, regular mortals, do not have the power to remove a dynastic leader. Okay? All right, so you see the Shang dynasty. That is pretty daggone big for the time period. You see the outline of where China currently is and Mongolia on top of it. So Mongolia is vast. So you can see that Shang is almost as big as Mongolia. And that is very significant. It's almost as big as the rulers, the Mauryan rulers and the Guptas in India. So that is a large group of people under the centralized dynastic control. Let's take a look at what it was like to live in the Shang dynasty. There's two very significant things that I want to start with. They first believed in ancestor worship. So when a man or woman died in China, it was believed that their spirit never left, that your family members kind of hung around you as spirits and would watch. And if you did good things and you were a good person, they would help you, they would bring you good luck. But if you were a bad person, then they could do bad things to you, play tricks on you, make bad things happen, take your luck away, kind of thing. So you, as a Chinese individual in ancient China, in Huang He, you would always talk about your ancestors that had passed in a positive light. You would hold great parties for them. So you're worshiping the memory of your ancestor with the idea that they are always watching you, which I find just a little bit creepy. So how do they contact their ancestors when they want to talk to them? They don't just talk out loud. They actually use something called oracle bones. And oracle bones were turtle shells most often. Sometimes they would find the breastplate of another type of animal or a large bone from another type of animal, but the most often used one was the breastplate of very large turtles. And they would etch a message to their ancestor in this shell, and then they would take it to a priest, sometimes called a seer. Usually it was a woman. They believed that women were a little bit more magical than men. And this priest would etch the question into the oracle bone, whatever it was. It might be, what's the gender of my baby? Will the crops be good? Does he love me or not? Think of all the things that you could possibly ask your dead ancestors. And the priest or the seer would etch it into the shell, and then she would heat up a large needle, make it super, super hot, and kind of tap the turtle shell all over the place, and it would crack it when she tapped it with this little needle. And when she was done tapping it, and she had like a process how to do it, how many taps and where to tap, but when she was done, she would read the cracks that were created by that needle. When the needle hit the shell, it cracked it, and so she would read the cracks, and that would be the answer to the message. It's like reading tea leaves, like gypsies read tea leaves. So oracle bones were very, very much believed in by everybody in the Huang He ancient river valley civilization. So why oracle bones? We're not really sure exactly where that came from or why they were using turtle shells more often than anything else. We're not actually positive about that stuff. But one of the cool things that we did get from the oracle bones is their writing. So they wrote on these things, and it lasted for a really long time. It's shell. So we've got tons and tons of this stuff that we have uncovered in archaeological digs. And so because of that, we know that their writing back then was very much like it is today. So the modern world can thank them for that. The characters that they use from the ancient Huang He people, they haven't changed a lot of those over time. It's believed that they got about 1,200 different characters from the Shang dynasty, and over the years, the Chinese people have just added and added and added. So today they have tens of thousands of them. So Chinese is supposed to be a very, very difficult language, written language. They do have a universal language that they use for things like newspapers and magazines so that everyone can read it. But they locally, one character in your village may not be the same character in another village. Locally, they have a different type of alphabet that they use, or I guess you would call it an alphabet that they use. So if you go to a town that isn't close to you and go visit somebody, you might not be able to read the local stuff, the signs on the store windows and stuff like that. So it has gotten very, very complicated over time, but their writing is ancient. It goes all the way back to this Huang He civilization. That's pretty impressive. All right, so here's a decent example of it. So very large shell, asking the question, the seer again cracks it and then reads the cracks. In all, archaeologists have uncovered about 100,000 oracle bones from the Shang dynasty. And many of them, like I mentioned before, are everyday questions like about the gender of an unborn child, or will the crops do well this year or not, that kind of thing. But sometimes we learn more about their social culture and their beliefs. One of the things that we have learned from oracle bones is that China did not have an organized religion during the Shang dynasty, or not for a very long time after the Shang dynasty has disappeared. So they don't get a religion until Asoka, remember in India, he kills all the innocent people of Kalinga and realizes how horrible it was, and so he becomes a Buddhist and then realizes that Buddhism is dying in India. So he pays missionaries to take it to other parts of the world and save it, and it becomes very embedded in China around 250 BCE, long after the Shang dynasty is gone, and Buddhism is still alive and well in China today. Most people in China are Buddhist, but know that the oracle bones indicate that there wasn't actually an organized religion in China during the Shang dynasty. Now there is mention of a god, but it doesn't seem to be this organized religion like the other religions that we've talked about so far. But this god's name is Qian. And the only real mention of Qian is that this god holds something called the mandate of heaven. Now remember, the Shang dynasty said that a dynastic ruler cannot be removed because ordinary mortals are not wise enough and powerful enough to remove a leader that has been chosen by a higher power. So Qian is kind of that higher power, and Qian has given this dynastic family the mandate of heaven, permission to rule. Qian is the one that's in charge of that. So he says this family gets to rule. Common mortals are not allowed to debunk that. You have to do whatever Qian says. So the mandate of heaven is just permission from this god to be the dynastic family. All right, so we're going to talk about a second dynasty that's going to come in. And I know that looks like a really complicated word, but it actually is pronounced Zhou. So the Zhou dynasty is second. They will come in and take over the Shang dynasty. So we've already talked about the fact that you can't take over a dynasty. So how does the Shang dynasty disappear and the Zhou family come in and take them over if mere mortals are not allowed to interrupt a dynasty? Here's what the Zhou people decided that they would live by. So that's right, Qian is the one that hands the mandate of heaven. But when very bad things start to happen, like bad crops, maybe there's a plague, maybe there's an earthquake. When things like that happen, according to the Zhou dynasty, that is an indication that Qian is no longer happy with the current dynasty and has removed the mandate of heaven to give it to someone else. And so this starts something called the dynastic cycle in China. So you are not set for the rest of eternity as the dynastic family anymore. If something bad happens during your rule, or even maybe like during your first child, something catastrophic happens the same time that your first child is born, you're like cursed. Qian has removed the mandate of heaven, and so dynasty after dynasty will start coming in and out of China, and it becomes known as a dynastic cycle. A dynasty comes in, bad things start to happen, everybody believes they've lost the mandate, and a new dynasty comes in. So the dynastic cycle in China. When the Zhou dynasty took China over, they were not doing well. The Shang dynasty had several rulers back to back that were not very good, very weak rulers, and the last one was actually very cruel. His people hated him. So by the time that the Zhous took over, there were a lot of issues in their dynasty that they needed to fix. And so they started looking to philosophies that they could bring in to unite the people of China and to kind of calm them down a little bit. You know, they were angry with the leaders that they had in the past. So they adopt two different philosophies, Confucianism and Taoism. Taoism is spelled either way that you see here, D or T. Both start between 500 and 400 BCE. So let's look first at Confucianism. Confucius put some ideas forward about how to restore social order. He was a philosopher, so Confucianism or Taoism, neither one are a religion. They're both a philosophy. Here is Confucius's basic beliefs. All people are good. Emphasis on education, and elders are always to be respected. So this is kind of the basis for society in China today. If you are in China, you're probably a Buddhist and a Confucianist. Okay, so let's take a little bit look at Confucius. He was a real man, but he was a very different man. He was probably at least 7 foot tall, if not a little bit taller. He also was born with a deformity. The top of his head had a giant dip in it. So this picture is actually a kind version of what Confucius looked like. Some sources that I read said that the dip in the top of his head was so deep that you could put fruit in it. So he most often wore a cap to cover it up, but people knew. He had very, very like astronomically large hands. He was just very disproportionate, and people were really cruel to him. Society shunned him. So he would, go out into the public, be tortured, and he would come home and he would write these beautiful, beautiful ideas of what people should be like to one another. So he used that adversity and that sorrow that other people caused him and turned it around. This is not how we should treat one another. This is how we should treat one another. So when he died, he was not famous. He was still shunned by the people of his dynasty, and so his papers were kind of hidden away. Nobody did anything with them until the Zhou dynasty came along and the Zhou family, and they somehow uncovered the work of Confucius many years after his death, and they loved it. It was this peaceful, wonderful moral compass to treat each other right, and so they immediately adopt it. And again, it's very prominent in China even today. Now, this is the symbol of Confucianism. Sometimes you will also see their symbol as yin and yang, which we will talk more about in a minute. Neither's wrong. Both are right. So either one of them can mean that you're talking about Confucianism. The second philosophy that I mentioned was Taoism, and the founder of Taoism is Lao Tzu. And the book that he wrote, he actually wrote a book. Confucius had many writings, but Lao Tzu actually wrote a real book, and it is called the Dou De Jing. Now, don't forget that just like Confucius, Lao Tzu was a philosopher, not a religious leader. So you've got two philosophies in the Zhou dynasty, and they are not religion at all. Okay, the only religion in China is Buddhism. So in China today, you are a Buddhist, a Confucianist, and a Taoist. Boy, that's a lot of pressure. Let's look at what Taoists believe in. All right, so people should not desire personal wealth and power. That goes really well along with Buddhism, right? Because the Four Noble Truths say that you're not supposed to want material things. They also believe that you should follow a very simple life. You should seek inner peace. Also goes really well with Buddhism because of that meditation, seeking inner peace, nirvana. So these two are definitely going to go hand in hand. But the big thing, the big thing for a Taoist is seeking harmony with nature. So Confucianists want harmony with people, Taoists want harmony with nature. So it's like they found these philosophies to kind of fill in gaps. All right, well, we've got how people should treat each other. Now we need to find a philosophy that talks about how we should treat our environment. And that's where the Taoists come in. And again, you have yin yang. This is also Taoism. So you might see it for Confucianism, you might see it for Taoism. Both are absolutely correct. So let's take a minute to look at what yin and yang are. Yin and yang are two opposing forces that balance each other out. Yin is light, yang is dark, and they balance each other out. So it's not good versus evil like a lot of people think. It's not. It's light and dark, which you could say light is good and dark is bad, but in the beginning it actually meant light and dark, not good and evil. And here you got a much prettier picture of yin and yang. All right, well, we're not done. They also have another thing, and this is pretty smart of the Zhou dynasty, right? They created something called legalism. That means the ruler has all the power, and no matter what, his laws must be obeyed. Pretty daggone smart. So while you're out there being kind to each other and you're chilling in nature like a hippie, you also have to be aware of the fact that your political leaders are in charge and they are never wrong. So pretty smart, right? And they really do still believe that in China. So in China, let's go through the list again. In China modern day, you are probably a Buddhist, Confucianist, Taoist, legalist. Even more pressure. That's a lot. All right, so if we're going to kind of sum these up, Confucianism, when you're looking at Confucianism, you would use Confucianist ideas when you're talking about the economy, the political life, definitely social interaction. Taoism is nature, and legalism basically means follow laws without question. Pretty smart people, this Zhou family. Let's talk about a third dynasty. This one is pronounced the Qin. I know, how do you get a ch out of Q? But that's what it's called, the Qin. And you can see we're still on the East Coast. The third dynasty began in 221. Again, it's called the Qin dynasty. And this dynasty was very concerned about protecting their people. More and more people had found these isolated Chinese people and tried to invade. And so a leader comes along under the Qin dynasty. His name is Shi Huangdi, and he's the first one ever to call himself emperor. And he decides that it's time to put up some defenses. We've got enough of these invaders from the north, probably coming through Mongolia. That's the best access point. And we need to somehow protect these small towns that are being overrun by the invaders. And so they started putting up walls just in small sections to keep the invaders out. Now later, that wall will those walls, those individual walls in the different towns, will be connected to form the Great Wall of China. But Qin did not set out to build the Great Wall of China. He just built little sections, and later other people will connect them. So if you read that someplace that Shi Huangdi was the first one to was the one who built the wall, that's not true. He just started it for protection in different places here and there, very small sections. So let's look at the Great Wall because it is one of the most well-known things about China. This thing is huge. Look at that. And they didn't hurt nature at all. Remember, because most of these people are going to be Taoist. So even to build the Great Wall of China, they just went with the flow of geography. They didn't blow holes through mountains and things like that like we do here in America. We love to blow things up and blow holes in mountains. These guys didn't. The wall followed the geography without hurting the geography. Look at this, beautiful. If there's a hill, you just got to run it up the hill. So there was a hope that astronauts would be able to see the Great Wall from space, and it was supposed to be the only man-made thing that could actually be seen from space. And so when it was attempted by the first group of astronauts to go up, they looked down and they could not see it. So they got a very small lens to magnify it a little bit, and then they could see it. So it can't be seen with the naked eye. You have to use some kind of magnification to be able to see it. But it is the largest man-made thing on the planet. So the fact that you have to use a little bit of magnification to see it, I don't think that makes it any less special. It really is an architectural feat that is just unmatched. All right, so let's learn a little bit about the wall. So it starts in 221 BCE. We're gonna say that's when they started connecting those walls that Shi Huangdi had put up here and there. So they start slowly connecting the walls in 221, but the actual wall is not complete until 1644. So that is a long, long time to build that wall. But it's massive. You needed a lot of time. It's 3,700 miles. So that is huge. It's only 3,000 miles from coast to coast here in America, and our country is gigantic. But this thing is 3,700 miles long, just massive. Sometimes it's been referred to as the longest cemetery on Earth, like the people were worked to death and they just fell over dead and people just put stuff on top of them. That is not true at all. It's not true. The people were not abused who built this wall. There are a few bodies in the wall. Sometimes there were accidents. I remember reading an article about one gentleman that it was kind of a higher up piece that they were building because it was, on a hill. And so the wall itself had to be very, very tall to keep the flow of the wall going. And he fell like down into the wall, and he died when he fell. So he was definitely dead. They could see him, but they couldn't get to him without endangering somebody else's life. And so his family was brought to the site and asked, do you want us to attempt to get his body out? We don't want anybody else to get hurt, but what do you want us to do? And the family said, honestly, our family has been working on this wall for generations. He would probably consider it an honor to be buried in the wall. And so that's what they did. And there were a couple situations where people asked to be buried within the wall, again, because it was a family thing that they had done for generations after generation. And so some people were actually permitted to be buried in the wall. So if we were to line up soldiers today to defend the entire wall, you would need 1 million soldiers. That's how big it is. So just absolutely gigantic. Can you hear the fire trucks going by? Yes, I live in the town of Strasburg, and our fire company is wonderful, but they really like to blow that horn. Anyway, okay, so 1 million soldiers to defend the wall. So there are other things that the Qin dynasty is very famous for, especially when it comes to Shi Huangdi. In 1970, or in the 70s, a couple of farmers were tilling their gardens, and they uncovered a terracotta warrior, this large life-sized warrior made out of terracotta clay, that orange clay that sometimes you can get the plant bowls made out of. So at first they thought that there was actually maybe a person inside of it, but it wasn't. It was just a statue. And it was where the farmland was. It was very close to the mausoleum of Qin Shi Huangdi. So it started to fall into place pretty quickly. This had something to do with his burial. So we've come to find out that it is funerary art. So these characters were buried with the emperor himself for whatever reason, just appreciate him. Who knows? But here's the site today. There are some of them that have been taken out of the site, and you can actually go see them. I actually got to go see them in, I think it was Philadelphia one year. So they bring a portion of the ones that they've uncovered all over the world, and you can go and see what they look like. They are very, very, very cool. But it got to be where China just was running out of money to dig these things up. We have no idea how many there actually are. They stopped digging. There were actually some giant full-size ships that China just does not have the money to get out. I mean, I can't even imagine how much money it must have cost to make all of this. And I guess they were like standing guard in front of his mausoleum underground. So in modern China, you can see all the little people. They built the building over the dig site, and people can pay to come in and look at the terracotta warriors in the holes that they were actually buried in. They've just uncovered them, dug the hole out, and put them back in it. So it is a really neat site to see. If you ever get a chance to see them on tour, do it, because it's really neat. So you can see that the men are all very different. They're dressed different from one another. The faces of every single character is different. There are no two alike. Can you see that? Isn't that unbelievable? And like I said, they're life size. I got to tell you, standing in the room that we were in with these guys all around us was actually kind of spooky. I mean, they're super lifelike, very, very detailed, down to the buttons on their jackets and stuff. I mean, it's just absolutely amazing. And the fact that they all do look different, it is creepy. Like, I understand why they thought that it was actually a man inside of it at first, because it does look like a real man. They have horses. Look at the chain. Can you believe that? That's made out of terracotta. The chain of that horse. It's just, the reins. That's just unbelievable. So look at these. This is the four faces that they believe, archaeologists and artists that have studied this, they believe that these are the four faces that whoever created these started with. So you had four molds, and then once the mold came out, you would change it a little bit. But it's believed that there were originally only four faces, and the artist took enough time to change those four faces thousands of times over to make individual looking men. Phew, crazy, crazy. I love the horses too. I wish that these were better pictures, but you weren't allowed to take pictures when I went to the museum, so I had to get stuff off the internet. But they do have full like a parade of horses in some of the shows that they bring around all over the world. I didn't get to see the four together. I saw the one with the guy holding it and the leather strap. Well, it looks like a leather strap, but it is absolutely amazing. And again, it seems like it was just a gift to this guy. They must have really loved him, or maybe he was just mean and nasty and made them do it. We don't know. I mean, we don't know. So if you ever get a chance, do it, see it. All right, so we're leaving the dynasties behind, most of them. I want to talk about some other contributions that China has made to the world. So the only thing we're going to learn about the Han Dynasty is the development of the civil service system, and I just think that we should give them credit. That's the only thing we're talking about for them. What is the civil service system? It is a test that is still used today in some parts of the world. We used to do that here in America quite a bit. You took a test that was created by the government, and it placed you in a job that you were fitted for based on the scores of your test. And so it was supposed to open up the doors to people who otherwise might not get a job, because if you pass the test and you do really well, you're automatically going to get a job. So it kind of did away with that nepotism kind of thing or playing favorites because it was a test score. So that was pretty significant for them. And even in our modern world, it wasn't that long ago that you had to take that civil service test in America to get a government job. So we adopted it. They also, oh my gosh, I could take hours to tell you the inventions that these people came up with. It's like they invented everything. There's a few that I want you to know significantly, and one that I feel is the most important is paper. They made actual honest to goodness paper, not papyrus like the Egyptians used. They made everything you can think of out of paper as well. Toilet paper, for one, was invented in China. So they created paper and then did all these other things with it. Rice paper that you see here in front of you for people to write on. Wallpaper, paper umbrellas, just money made out of paper. They were the very first ones to ever do that. So paper was the big one. They also invented porcelain. Think of all the things that we have made of porcelain. Dolls aren't the only thing. Your toilet is probably made out of porcelain. And these are the people that came up with it. They were the first to ever make a printing press. It will be perfected by a European later, but they're the first ones ever to do a printing press. They are the first ones ever to have fireworks. The first ones with a compass, they're the ones that invented it. And one of their most famous inventions, which we will talk about in later units, was silk. Honest to goodness, real silk, not that made up cheap stuff that we can get today and buy for a few dollars. The real stuff made from silkworms. So they're the guys that came up with it. Those are the top inventions that I can think of. There's millions more, but those are the top ones and the ones that you need to know for this unit. All right, so if they have all these great gadgets, how did we get this stuff from them since they're so isolated? They created a path, and it got the nickname the Silk Road because that was the one thing traded on that path that everyone wanted. Boy, can you hear all the alarms going off? I don't know if you guys are going to be able to hear it on the recording or not. If you can, I'm really sorry. Anyway, the Silk Road is that path that stretches all the way from the eastern coast of China, the furthest eastern coast, to the Mediterranean Sea. And the stopping point at one time was actually Aleppo. Remember, we talked about that. So the Silk Road was huge, and it is a path that people mapped out that you could actually get through. So you don't have to worry about mountains getting in your way. You knew what deserts were coming up, so you could try and prepare for that. So the Silk Road became a very, very prominent trading path, the prominent trading path in China. And again, don't forget the western end of the Silk Road was once Aleppo, but eventually it's going to go even further than that and actually touch the Mediterranean Sea. Here's a pretty good picture of it. You can see the different things that people traded along the Silk Road. So you didn't have just the Chinese using it. I mean, here's the picture. Look, it goes all the way to Constantinople and the Mediterranean Sea. So other people are trading with the Chinese along this road. So stops are different. A Chinese person might leave the Silk Road and only go one country over, trade, and come home. Other ones did go all the way to Constantinople. So it's not just goods, it's ideas, it's disease, it's culture and habits and language and everything that you can think of. It's not always something that you can hold. But this Silk Road really opened up our world to be connected to one another for the very first time, this path. All right, now the journey, I want you to know, was not easy. Most people, because it's concentrated there, most people followed the Huang He River at the start of the path. And once you left the river, then you would almost definitely start traveling in groups called caravans for protection. So in a caravan, you would follow the southern side of the Great Wall of China through the Gobi Desert, because it is not safe to travel the Gobi Desert by yourself. For one thing, you need lots of people to carry lots and lots of water. But there are thieves that lived in the Gobi Desert, and they would wait till, you'd been in the desert for a while, you weren't feeling too good, you were very tired and hot and thirsty and hungry, and then they would rob you. And you're not going to be able to put up much of a fight. So safety in numbers through the Gobi Desert, absolutely. So you might be a single guy up until then, but once you're ready to cross that desert, you're definitely going to be part of a caravan. There are other things that you have to go across as well. So I already talked about the Gobi. The Taklamakan Desert, unbelievably tough. There are places in Taklamakan Desert that it only rains once a year, and that's like half an inch. Traveling in the mountains was just as bad too. So it's not like you didn't have to go through the mountains, you have to. So all these geographical barriers were things that people that traded out of China had to put up with. So these guys sometimes were gone for years at a time, sometimes months, but sometimes years too. So you're leaving your family behind. And here you go. Look at that. Isn't that incredible? How would you like to have to take your goods with camels across that? Of course you're going to have a caravan. Otherwise, somebody is going to die. Absolutely. How did they even know where to go? Well, they had compasses. There you go. They had a compass. That wouldn't do me much good in a place like this. I think I would be lost even with a compass. But they mapped out that Silk Road and they knew what they were doing. All right, so let's look at the different dynasties. We're mapping them all out. We've got the Shang dynasty, taken over by the Zhou dynasty, taken over by the Qin dynasty. Okay, all right, so that is it for the ancient river valley civilizations. I will see you in Greece not too long from now.